Well, for more on this, we're joined now by the former UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and also Executive Director of the Berghoff Foundation in Berlin. Andrew Gilmour, thank you very much indeed for being with us here on Al Arabiya News. Great to have you with us. I'd like to start by asking for your take on that ultimatum that the United States has issued to Israel. They've said to Israel, you've got 30 days to boost humanitarian aid flows into Gaza or risk US military assistance. And I just want to ask you, first of all, what you read into this message and why it's been given. And second of all, what sort of a difference it would make to Israel were Washington to come good on that threat.
I read into that message that the Americans are absolutely privately appalled by the devastating human rights abuses and casualties inflicted by the Israeli bombardment and by the humanitarian disaster. As to your second question, what it would have, what impact it would have an absolutely devastating effect on Israel if they believed it. And I suspect they don't, because there's nothing that they have done or they think that they can do that would lead to such an outcome. They simply do not believe that the Americans will actually blow the red whistle on them and say this is absolutely unacceptable, because if they've killed this many civilians over the past year and seem to be planning to kill a great many more in the next month, and I noted that they've been given another 30 days sort of grace period to do it, I don't really see what incentive they would have to change their tactics. I don't think they believe the Americans will do that. And in any case, the Israelis will be thinking of the American elections, which the results will be known by then, so that they will factor that into their calculations too.
It's quite late in the day, isn't it, as a threat, given that we're more than a year into the horrific humanitarian situation in Gaza and now an unfolding humanitarian disaster in Lebanon as well. Are you surprised that America hasn't said more and sooner than what it put out, I think it was on Sunday when that letter was sent to Israel?
Yes. I mean, had it been the Trump administration in power, I don't suppose I would have been surprised. But I am surprised that the Biden administration, or rather, I was surprised, but over the past year, I've stopped being surprised. There seems to be literally no limit that can cross their threshold.
Yeah, I was going to ask you later in the program, but now seems like an apt moment to ask you this question, because, of course, there are just 2.5 months left of the Biden administration. And I'm just wondering what its legacy will be with regards to events in the Middle East.
I wish the Biden administration I have no ill will towards them. But in terms of the Middle East, what they have allowed, what they have not just allowed, but provided full-on diplomatic, political, moral, and above all, military support for in the last year is surely what they will be remembered for. And the fact that the casualty rate is so high, that the suffering is so high, that the deliberate targeting of journalists and UN workers in Gaza, and now major harassment of UN forces in southern Lebanon, and of course civilians in Lebanon as well. I don't see how they can be remembered for anything other than that, a series of vague sort of trying to pressure Israel in the gentlest possible way, in private, they say, but we don't know because nothing in public is really said about it, asking them to behave in a more restrained way, less lethal way. But I don't think they can be remembered for anything other than presiding over this humanitarian cataclysm, frankly.
And diplomatic failures, because countless visits to the region by the US Secretary of State have yielded no results. There hasn't been a ceasefire in Gaza since November of last year. So clearly, very few success stories to their name with regards to diplomacy.
Very, very few indeed, absolutely. But I think we can explain that in the sense that they had no stick. They just pleaded with the Israelis, please don't kill quite so many children. And the Israelis say, why should we listen to you? Because what are you going to do if we don't? So, and the Israeli leadership had that calculus. all along that they could get away with this.
Just talking about the humanitarian situation in Gaza more specifically, earlier on this year you said in Gaza we're probably seeing the highest kill rate of any military since the Rwandan genocide of 1994. Two questions on that. Do you stand by that statement, and can we switch it from probably to definitely? And are you, in comparing the kill rate to the Rwandan genocide, prepared to describe and characterize what's happened in Gaza as having been a genocide?
No, I said that, and interestingly, I said probably because I wasn't sure, that in that period, I think I said it in March, or possibly it's February, that in between October and February, no, and I shouldn't have said military, because actually the people who did the killing in Rwanda were not military, they were militias. But of course, in Gaza, it was very much a military. But nobody had killed that many civilians, in particular women and children, at such a high ratio. A number of people questioned that, but nobody, literally nobody, including people who wrote in angry letters to the messages to the BBC, ever came up with a previous example in the last 30 years that indicated that there had been a higher kill ratio. So on that grounds, I don't know for absolute certain that one can't find another example elsewhere in the world in the last 30 years, but I know that nobody has been able to present one to me in the last 7 months since I said that.
Let's talk about this so-called general's plan. The general's plan is a plan put together by a group of retired Israeli generals, and their plan would be to starve out Hamas militants from northern Gaza by sealing off humanitarian aid. Obviously, hundreds of thousands of people's lives would be in danger, the lives of innocent civilians. How seriously do you think that plan is being taken by the Israeli Prime Minister?
Of course, I don't know how seriously, but I would have thought that the fact that, as you've just said, such tactics would lead to hundreds of thousands of people having to be moved yet again and going through famine situation and bombardment and everything else, leading to probably tens of thousands more casualties. From what we have seen, both of the Israeli generals and of the Israeli leadership, I don't see why that would hold them back in the absence of sustained international pressure. And as we discussed before, the Israelis don't feel that there is sustained international pressure for them to desist from such a policy.
Such a policy would be illegal, though, wouldn't it, under international law? And it would set some very dangerous precedents for other countries to employ in the future. And it would be very difficult to then hold them to account for having done so.
Absolutely. And for those of us, including myself, for example, who also feel very strongly about very probable Russian war crimes in Ukraine, for example, it is very problematic because when we talk about these issues in Ukraine, other people point out, well, hang on, why are you silent about Gaza, where actually there are probably worse war crimes being committed? So, of course, it's a terrible precedent. And that is, for anybody who's been involved in the human rights movement globally, I mean, the great problem is when people take a selective approach. Because if you take the view that war crimes are only committed by my enemies and anybody I like can't commit war crimes because they're my friend, and we won't call them out on it, then that just destroys the whole basis for discussing human rights and violations, serious violations, which are known as serious violations of international humanitarian law, is a long-winded way of saying war crimes. And all of that effort to raise awareness and try to get people to be less willing to carry out such actions is weakened when there is a selective approach. But of course, there's a lot more that's been illegal, and indeed the UN Secretary General and indeed many other leading international players, including the EU's Commissioner Borrell, have been pretty outspoken about this, but it hasn't had much of an impact, as you can see.
Yeah, and just you wearing your former UN hat, I'd like to ask you about the United Nations, because, of course, they seem to have run out of adjectives to describe the situation in Gaza. The words totally unacceptable have become rather hollow because they're so overused. And I just want to ask you, I mean, clearly Israel has an issue with UNRWA in Gaza, UNIFIL in Lebanon, these UN institutions. And the Israeli Energy Minister, Eli Cohen, has described the UN as being a failed organization. I just wondered whether you think, given that the UN has not managed to prevent the degree of bloodshed in Gaza, whether perhaps he's got a point.
Well, those two issues you just mentioned don't cancel each other out, because on the one hand, if it's weak, it's weak because the member states have not put their weight behind the UN. And this is a perennial issue. I worked for the UN for 30 years. Member states talk about UN values, but when it comes to actually supporting the UN, when the UN is in a difficult position, they don't do it. And my former colleagues in the United Nations, and I'm in close contact with many of them, are absolutely frustrated by the lack of support they get from the Europeans and the Americans. But the Europeans at least generally speak more in terms about international law and trying to observe it and trying to stand up for the values of the UN Charter. And so when they don't do so and actually provide support, real support for the UN when they need it, then of course the UN can't be expected to do that. But as you know very well, the reasons why the Israelis attack the UN isn't because they failed to stop the killings in Gaza. It's because they actually dare to criticize Israel for the way they handle these situations. So I mean, they don't criticize it for being weak, they criticize it for being outspoken.
So you're saying basically they find them inconvenient and they get in the way of them doing what they want to do in Lebanon, hence their desire for UNIFIL to disband and leave southern Lebanon, and in Gaza with, in particular, the sights being set on UNRWA. And we've heard from Philippe Lazzarini, who heads up UNRWA, that Israel is, quote, bent on destroying UNRWA. And of course, we gather that Israel would like to ban UNRWA from operating in Israeli territory, which would leave them unable to function. How would Gaza survive without UNRWA? Could it?
I just correct you. It's not that they wouldn't allow UNRWA to operate on Israeli territory. They weren't allowed to operate in Palestinian territory. And that is the crux, of course. They... Since UNIFIL was set up in Lebanon in 1978, 338 UN peacekeepers, blue helmets, have been killed. Now, the UN, we don't have a column for who killed them. Sometimes it's not absolutely clear. But I can tell you a very large number of that 338 have been killed by the Israelis. And we also know that over 200 UN staff have been killed in Gaza in the last 12 months. Many of them targeted. Many of them aren't just bombings, but they are precisely got in their homes, and of course, the address of every UN staff member is known by the Israelis. So there's definitely an inconvenience. And that's why no journalist is being allowed by Israel into Gaza. Of course, they don't want. It's an inconvenience if people see what's going on from that end. So both the UN and journalists are highly inconvenient. And I think that it also explains why quite so many journalists have also been killed in Gaza.
Just to wrap up, I mean, there is this draft Israeli legislation that would ban UNRWA from operating in Israeli territory. That's what we gather. It's draft legislation. So that's what I was getting at in my earlier question. But we're going to leave it there. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Andrew Gilmour, thank you very much indeed.